In this portion, I'm going to be working on the sea oats and seagrass, and I'll be using this extra long bristle brush made by Princeton. I'm going to be using some Prussian blue, some cadmium yellow medium, and a touch of red to gray it down slightly. And this requires a lot of turpentine, and you have to keep adding turpentine to your mix and then practicing, as I'm doing here, to decide exactly how much is enough. And it's also good to practice if you've never used a rigger before, or if your rigger happens to be new, before you commit to the painting. I would do some practice to determine how much turpentine you actually need for your to work with your extra long bristle. These sea oats are going to be in the distance, so I don't want to make them very long. Another pointer is that you need to make your strokes different. You don't want them all to be lined up in little straight lines, and this is why you need to practice on your palette pad before you actually start to make the marks. Even though you can remove this paint with your turpentine, it never really goes away, so make sure before you start putting your strokes on the canvas that you have a feel for how to turn your hand, and at a certain point you just need to know when to vary the strokes. And some of my strokes are going to be a little thicker than others, but that's the nature of the beast. I'm going to be changing my brushes at this point, and I'll be using a Robert Simmons, and it is a 0. It's a little shorter bristles, but it's still considered a liner brush, or even a rigger, you could call it. And I'm going to be using the rigger, the Robert Simmons, to do the sea oats at the end of the marsh grass. Now, one thing about sea oats you may not know is that they change colors. They are very much like leaves that change at the end of the summer, beginning of the fall. When they're new, they're green, and as the summer goes along, they dry out and they turn to a wheat color, or an oat color, I guess we could say, that the viewer was not going to be able to see all that I'm doing on this. Notice that I am not only using the full length of the bristle in these liner brushes, but I'm also using the very tip to create smaller shapes, and I'm also putting the bristles sideways and lifting up to create even more different shapes. A lot of tiny details. None of them are hard. The one thing you need to keep remembering is not to have regular patterns. You don't want all your grasses to be straight up and standing like little soldiers. Bristles is to work in some other colors and shapes, and they're all sizes of little grassy patches and little vines that grow out of the base of the sea oats. Because my sea oats are a little further back than I usually place them, I'm having to do a lot more individual details than I usually do. I'm usually able to make those happen with my bristle brush, and I will be able to go over them, but while I have these liner brushes and I have paint that's the right color and the right consistency, I just went ahead and did those details. But you'll learn ways, if you haven't already, to make that happen a little faster. And there we have what was going on the other side of the painting that you could not see. My next step will be to do some highlights on the seagrasses. and add some other colors to make it more interesting. A lot more little grasses to be put in individually. This is probably the most tedious part. I have allowed my green grasses to dry again so that I can do some more work on my sand. My sand is not totally white, so I have to give the appearance of some areas that are highlighted more than others. And the time to do that is before I put more grasses in. So I'm using a significant amount of liquid, but you really have to be careful because you can use too much so that your color is too transparent. So you have to kind of gauge that on your own. Let me say a word about mediums. I prefer liquid because it dries a little glossier and it allows my paint to dry faster, which is one of the main reasons for using it here in highlighting my sand, so I can get on with the rest of the grasses more quickly. But liquid does not cause the paint to dissipate when I put my brush into it, whereas with odorless turpentine, which is what I use to clean my brushes, and in some instances to thin my paint somewhat. But when you put your brush into turpentine and you have paint on your brush, then it does dissipate into the turpentine, so that if you take that same paintbrush and put it back in the paint that's on your palette, it will contaminate it. And so the best case scenario is to use the turpentine for cleaning your brush and for dampening your brush, not wetting it, but dampening it, but always have a cloth handy to squeeze out the excess turpentine. Well, my sand has dried and I'm ready to do some finishing touches. And actually I have many touches that will be done on this particular part of the painting. And I'm using, in the beginning here, the cobalt blue, cadmium yellow light, and a little bit of burnt sienna. And there will be not only some brownish greens, but greens that will take care of the rest of these specks and grasses. And there'll be many, many more grasses, but they don't take long. They're just a little tedious, and they require two things: a good brush, a good liner brush, and plenty of turpentine. But you'll have to judge how much is enough just based on your practice on your palette pad, which I've suggested before. notice that I am moving around from place to place on the painting. That's to keep me from forming those ugly patterns, and also to help me to spread the paint that I'm having my brush from point to point. There's another method to get the specks into this foreground, and that is using a toothbrush. I do caution about toothbrushes though. When you mix your color on the palette, make sure that you practice on your palette, because this could be a serious mistake if you get too much on here. But just work with it, and if it's too transparent, you need to add more color, and every time you do that, you need to pay attention to how much is coming off of the toothbrush. You also need to pay attention to where those spatters are going. In this case, I was doing this over my painting so that I could demonstrate, but I found out later that I was spattering on my sky, and I found a few specks on my drape, which is right beside the table where I paint. So do be careful. And as you will see in just a few minutes, it is very difficult to remove those spatters. If you get too much, or in this case, I actually ended up with green spatters, which is fine unless you're going to try to get rid of them. And I'm going to spare you all the pain of watching what I had to go through to get this finished. Now, having said that, let me say that at the end of this video, I will still have some touch-up work that I need to do, but I have a timeline for finishing this part, so I will have to do that and do it aside from the videotaping. Just trust that it will be better when I'm finished. And I hope you're enjoying watching this, and don't be too discouraged if you have an accident like I did in this bottom left-hand corner. Just do what you need to do to finish it up, and I will be back with more videos after this. Thank you for visiting, and thank you for liking, commenting, sharing what you like or don't like about these video series, and please also subscribe to my channel. You may also see my other paintings on my website, which is www.delbellew.com. And that will also be on the concluding page of this video. And again, thank you for coming. It means a lot. I can see as I'm watching this demonstration on video that those little sandy hills are way too highlighted. So I'm going to have to blend those in better. But as you can see, I'm finally beginning to work out the problems on that left-hand corner. But it's still going to take quite a bit more painting to make that happen. And the photograph that you will see at the end of this video is not the finished product. One of the disadvantages in using oils for something like this is that blending becomes difficult if you have to make these kinds of changes while the paint is still wet. So sometime in the next few hours I'll be able to go back and finish up and make this all right again. So don't be discouraged if something like this happens to you. It's just the nature of oil paint.